The Pizza Man. Written by Mark Leslie. Narrated by Chris Humphreys. Carl was hovering on the edge of consciousness when he became aware of the faint smell of pepperoni, tomato sauce, and cheese. It was just strong enough to make him realize how long it had been since he'd had a filling meal. And though physically exhausted, having spent the day moving into the old two-story brownstone just a few blocks away from the university, the scent of the pizza kept luring him by the stomach and slowly pulling him out of his sleep. Carl's first conscious thought was of a jealous, annoying nature. Sure, he was grateful that his cousin Rick, now in his second year of university, had allowed him to move into the newly rented 4-bedroom home with two of his classmates, the very lovely Nancy and Marty. But Carl was a freshman, completely new to town and living on his own, and still felt a bit like an outsider among the small group of 4. The thought that Rick and the girls had ordered a late-night pizza without waking and inviting him to join them just added to that sense of being an outsider. There was a rustling outside his bedroom door, and he sat up in the bed, now fully awake. The smell of pizza seemed stronger, and although he couldn't see the door of his room, as it opened, he could hear the slight, whispered sigh as it moved. Because there didn't seem to be any lights on in the rest of the house, not even a sliver of light coming from down the stairs, a shiver spread through Carl, and he felt an immediate surge of goosebumps swelling on his arms. He instinctively reached for where the bed lamp had been back in his bedroom in his parents' home, but finding no light to turn on, no sense of familiar security to grasp, released a quiet whimper. Through the darkness, he heard a muted whispering from just inside his doorway, and he gripped the sheets in fear. His eyes had become more accustomed to the dimly lit room, and he could start to make out a figure standing in the doorway, a short figure. "Carl?" It was a female voice. His panic quickly subsided as he recognized the voice and stature. It was Marty, the tiny girl with the long, dark, curly hair and big green eyes. Though he couldn't see her in the dark, his mind harkened back to how he'd spent much of that day when they were all moving furniture into the house, gazing longingly at Marty's smooth, sun-browned legs, and how her breasts strained against the confines of her t-shirt with the efforts of lifting and unpacking boxes. And now, here she was in his room. More goosebumps filled his arms, but for a different reason. Here was this beautiful, sexy girl now in his bedroom in the middle of the night. "Yeah?" "Do you smell that pizza?" She found the light switch and turned it on. Carl covered his eyes, squinting at her through his hands. "Uh-huh. Are Rick and Nancy cooking downstairs?" "No," she said. "There's no light coming from down there. And besides, we don't have the ingredients to make a pizza." There was a soft knock at the front door, which carried clearly up the stairs and into Carl's room. "What time is it?" Carl asked. 1:45. They waited in silence, staring at each other. There was another soft knock. "Is someone gonna get that?" Rick yelled sleepily from his bedroom. "And while you're at it, keep it down, you two." Carl hopped out of bed and his face flushed. He'd momentarily forgotten he was wearing only his underwear. He quickly grabbed his housecoat from where it sat piled at the foot of his bed. He headed down the stairs with Marty close behind him. They crept down in the dark, and when they reached the bottom, headed down the hall toward the front door. As they got closer, Carl felt along the wall for the switch to the outside light and flicked it on. The front porch light came on to reveal a dark figure backlit in the door window, a pizza box held high in his left hand. The knock sounded once more, this time urgently. The smell of tomato sauce and pepperoni was stronger than before as Carl stepped closer to the door. The figure was easier to make out now. Carl could see it was a male, a blonde teenager with a few thick red pimples and a striking solid cleft chin. And even though he shouldn't have been able to see through the glass and into the darkened hall, his blue eyes seemed to follow Carl and Marty as they moved closer to the door. Pizza? Carl asked through the closed door. Large pepperoni and mushroom. Carl opened the door. The smell of pizza was even stronger and more tantalizing. Carl heard his stomach rumble in response. He wanted this pizza, mistake or not. What's the damage? $13.50. The blonde teenager flashed a white, toothy grin at Marty. I'll be right back, Carl said, turning to sprint up the stairs to get his wallet. When he got upstairs, he found his wallet still in the back pocket of the jeans he'd thrown into the pile of clothes at the foot of his bed. He was just pulling the wallet out when he heard Marty scream. Are you sure you weren't sleepwalking? Rick asked, lying in his bed facing the wall. Carl, Marty, and Nancy were all standing in his bedroom doorway. She couldn't have been, Carl said. We told you. I was there too. I saw him. Besides, you heard the knock yourself. All right. Rick rolled over to face them. You go downstairs. There's a pizza guy at the door. No one ordered a pizza. So far, no big deal. Mistakes happen, right? So Carl goes to get some money. Marty feels a draft, so asks the pizza guy to step inside. She steps around to close the door, and when she turns around, she can't see him. He's not there. Trembling, Marty looked at the floor. He vanished, just like that, gone. Look, Rick said, people can't just vanish into thin air. It's impossible. Then what happened, Rick? Carl placed a reassuring hand on Marty's shoulder. When I heard Marty scream, I ran back downstairs and found Marty passed out in the hallway. The door was open, and the pizza guy was gone. Nancy nodded vigorously. Upon hearing Marty's scream, she had bounded out of bed, followed Carl downstairs, and helped him revive Marty. Listen to yourselves, Rick said. All the evidence is there that he didn't vanish. Here's what probably happened, Marty. When you turned around and couldn't see him, he was probably standing in your blind spot. And then you freaked out, screamed, and fainted. He paused to smirk. And you scared the hell out of him. What would you do in his situation if some stranger asked you to step into their house at 1 a.m. and then turned around and screamed at you? You'd get the hell out of there, wouldn't you? That doesn't make sense, Nancy said, because the door was open. He must have been scared and ran off after Marty fainted. They stood in Rick's room for a few minutes, reassuring themselves that everything was okay, until Rick said that enough was enough, get out of his room, so he could get back to sleep. During the rest of the night, Carl slept restlessly. He kept hearing a soft knocking at the door and was positive by the odor in the air that someone had brought a freshly cooked pizza into the house. A few times during the night, Marty called out from her room that she heard a noise downstairs. Just as many times, Rick yelled out for her to shut up and get back to sleep. When Carl opened the fridge to get himself and his 3 housemates a fresh round of beer, a partially torn and half-faded sticker caught his eye. Sure, he'd seen it yesterday, but suddenly something about the red graphic on it, the chubby man with a beard holding a steaming pizza, had a new familiarity to it. He'd seen that same graphic on the pizza box the blonde teenager had brought to the door the night before. The faded letters, Jimbo's Pizza, were still readable on the sticker, as was the phone number. It wasn't difficult convincing the rest of the housemates that ordering a pizza was a good idea, particularly since it had been 4 hours since they'd had supper, their fine gourmet meal of hot dog wieners with a side of macaroni and cheese. Inspired by the disappearing pizza guy from the night before, Carl suggested they order a large pepperoni and mushroom. It'll be here in half an hour, or it's free, Carl said, as he stood in the entranceway to the living room, and it comes to $14.25. Come on, pony up the dough. They all flipped their beer caps at him in response. Carl couldn't help smiling. This was exactly how he'd imagined moving away and going to university would be. Fun, freedom, playful adventure, and— his eyes settled momentarily on Marty, on the cute wrinkle in the corner of her eyes as she flipped another beer cap at him— hanging out with gorgeous women. Once they ran out of beer caps, they started figuring out how to divide the cost of the pizza. It was easiest to round up, with tip, to $16, so they could each contribute $4. Carl had settled back down on a milk crate propped up beside the armchair Marty was sitting in and was about to ask about her hometown, try to determine if there was a boyfriend back there, when there was a soft knock at the door. Holding the money he collected, Carl got up and rounded the corner to the front door. The blonde-haired teen from the night before smiled uneasily at him as the door opened. His blue eyes seemed a little more sunken, and his face was quite paler than the previous night. The pizza guy smiled at him. "Large pepperoni and mushroom, $13.50. Carl took the pizza box, and having been ready with the $16, turned and took a half-step back to shoot a confused look at his roommates. "It comes to $13.50? I thought you said it was $14.25, Rick asked. Carl shrugged and turned back to the door. The young blonde was no longer standing in the doorway. He stepped forward, peered out the door, and was greeted by a soft September wind. The dark street was empty of both cars and pedestrians. He closed the door and went back into the living room with the pizza. "Looks like this one is free," he said. Hungry and drawn to the scent oozing from the box, they gathered on the floor around the pizza box. Rick tore cheesy pieces off and handed them around, nibbling on the strings of cheese from each one. Marty shifted her piece from hand to hand. "Oh, hot!" Nancy sank her teeth in, starting to make the low, satisfied moan of enjoying the taste. The moan quickly changed in pitch to a startled yelp, and she threw the pizza slice into the air. It landed face up on the carpet, and the layer of cheese seemed to slide about on its own. A large beetle peered out from under the cheese, and then scurried quickly beneath the sofa. Marty dropped her slice and screamed as a cockroach hopped off her slice and scuttled down her arm. Rick quickly swatted it off, and it hurried to join the beetle under the sofa. "What the hell?" Carl mumbled, throwing his piece against the wall. It landed crust up, and a pair of bugs quickly ran from beneath it to hide under the armchair. Rick dropped his slice into the box as they all jumped to their feet. The pizza, still left untouched, seemed to be slithering around in the box. The cheese moved as if the surface were a liquid on a tilting, rotating surface. "Jesus," Rick said, spitting out the bits of cheese he'd been chewing, and threw up. He stayed bent over, not quite finished, and barfed again. Nancy joined him for the second round. Rick, still green in the face, wiped his mouth and looked up at Carl, who was about to contribute the contents of his own stomach to the mess on the floor. There was a loud knock on the door. "Oh my God!" Marty yelled and leaned forward, retching. Rick went to the door, and Carl followed, pausing to flip the top of the pizza box closed. The door opened, and a dark-haired, middle-aged man with an unsightly amount of pockmarks on his face stood holding an insulated pizza bag at waist level. "Jimbo's Pizza," he mumbled. "Large pepperoni and mushroom. That'll be $14.25. The second pizza sat on the kitchen table, uneaten. Rick had taken a knife through it and discovered no roaches or bugs of any kind, dead or alive. Nonetheless, not a single one of them had any appetite. They simply stared at each other across the table. "I don't understand it," Marty said, the green in her face almost completely gone. "What does it mean?" Rick asked. Carl got up and went down the hall to the living room. He came back with the bill that had been stapled to the first pizza box. "What's that for?" Nancy asked, laying her head on Rick's shoulder. Rick stroked her short blonde hair. "Take a close look," Carl said, "at the date penciled in. It says the 4th of September, but today is the 3rd. And look at the year. It's last year's date." Rick grabbed the bill from him and studied it. Then he looked at the bill on the pizza box on the table. Today's date, proper day, proper year. So we have 3 conflicting bits of information: the price, the day, and the year. I'll bet if we called Jimbo's, we might learn something more. "Like what?" Rick asked. "I'm not sure, but there has to be some explanation. Rick, why don't you call Jimbo's?" "Why?" "Well, we did receive a defective pizza from them." Rick's eyes lit up, and he got up from the table and picked up the phone. "You're right. They owe us." He dialed the number, told the person what happened, and then described the delivery person. "No," he said into the phone, "this isn't a joke." His face went white, and his mouth opened silently as he listened. He paused, and then hung up the phone without saying another word. "What?" "According to the guy on the phone, this blonde-haired kid disappeared in our neighborhood 1 year ago tomorrow. He's presumed dead, but his body has never been found." Carl sat up in his bed, startled awake. Was that a noise downstairs? He carefully flipped away the covers and went to the door, flicking on his bedroom light. A sudden blue flash lit the room as the switch clicked on, and then the room quickly receded back into darkness. He stood there, blinded and momentarily confused. Of all the times for the bulb to die. Grumbling, he stumbled in the dark over to his desk and lit the room with his small desk lamp, creating an eerie, shadowy landscape of his bedroom. Looking over at his digital clock, he saw it was 1:30 a.m. He stuck his head out the bedroom door and confirmed that everyone else was sleeping by the fact that there was no light appearing at the cracks on the bottom of their doors. He went back into his room, slipped back under the sheets, and began reading the paperback sitting on his nightstand. Though his eyes passed over the words, he wasn't actually reading them. Instead, his mind was going over the details he'd found when researching online about the teenage pizza boy's disappearance the previous year. His name was Steve Buick. He was 18 and had been working at Jimbo's Pizza for only 6 months when a call into this same neighborhood had been the last time he'd ever been seen. He simply disappeared, and his abandoned car was found in a nearby parking lot. Carl had found 4 or 5 archived articles online from 2 of the local newspapers, but nothing after that. No indication of the teenager being found either dead or alive. He must have fallen asleep, because the next thing he knew was being startled awake sometime later upon hearing a noise, one he could only imagine as a bony elbow bumping against wooden paneling. This time he left the bedroom and decided to head down the stairs, deciding not to wake anyone else up. He noticed a sliver of light appear under Marty's door as soon as he stepped on the stair second from the top, and making a gritting moan of shifting wood. So he wasn't the only one who had awakened. He waited for her door to open and her head to appear, and looked at her from the stairs with an "It's only me" smile. She smiled back, sleepily. "Did you hear that noise?" she asked. He nodded. "I'm going to check it out." "Why don't you wake up Rick?" "No," he smiled, "not after last night. He'll probably clobber me if I disturb his beauty rest. Tell you what, if I don't come back in 2 minutes, wake him and send him down." He had said it jokingly, in the hopes it might relieve the tension, but Marty frowned disapprovingly at him. "No," she whispered. "Don't go." "It's okay." He forced a smile. "Stop that, you're scaring me." He eased down the stairs, and as he reached the bottom, the elbow-hitting wood sound came again. He turned the corner to find the front door open, and that the wind had blown it up against the wall, making that noise. They must not have closed it properly in all the confusion over the 2 pizzas. He walked up to the door and closed it. He had to push it extra hard before he heard the click of it latching closed. Yes, he thought that was it. It simply wasn't closed properly. He turned the deadbolt, ensuring it was locked, and made his way down the hall and back up the stairs. At the top, he explained to Marty that it had only been the door, and it was then they both seemed to realize he had been wearing only his blue briefs and nothing else. Marty looked up from glancing at his jockey shorts to find him looking back, suddenly embarrassed, but trying desperately to pretend he wasn't. As he rounded the top of the stairs, he noticed Marty was backlit from the light in her room. He could make out her naked silhouette and the sides of the large satiny globes of her bosom. He shyly averted his eyes, feeling an instant stirring in his groin, and shuffled past her into his room, hoping she hadn't noticed. "Good night," he said, thinking that if this were a movie, he would have simply continued to eye her naked silhouette, and she would notice the growing bulge in his shorts, and they would embrace, collapsing onto the floor in her room, and make frenzied love, fade to black, and roll the credits. But this wasn't a movie, it was real, and he was too hesitant, too unsure, and probably too excited over nothing. "Good night, Carl." She crossed from her door and headed to the bathroom. And she paused, taking another glance down at the bulge in his shorts. "Thanks for the, unspoken compliment?" Was all he managed to mutter as the door to the bathroom closed. He stood there a moment, alone with his semi-erection, and feeling even more stupid. Still unsure what to do and not wanting to look like an idiot, he went back into his room, leaving his door open, and crawled under the sheets. As his mind was racing with thoughts of Marty and whether or not she might come into his room and what might happen between the 2 of them if she did, he heard the noise of the imagined elbow hitting the wall. The door had blown open again. But how? He had definitely locked it. Marty's voice came from the bathroom, calling him. He yelled back for her to stay in the bathroom and keep the door locked. Not that a locked door seemed to help, but he didn't know what else to suggest. Another noise came from downstairs, another sound of something colliding into a wall, and this time it was louder, closer, coming from the bottom of the stairs. Rick called out groggily from his room for them to stop making all that noise and get the hell back to sleep. That was when Carl heard the creaking groan of the step that was second from the top. The sound pierced the dark night the way that fingernails on a blackboard cut through a silent classroom. "Rick!" Carl screamed. "There's someone in the house!" But he knew someone wasn't the right word. He should have said something. As Carl watched, a dark shadow moved across the hall toward his bedroom door, and with it came the smell of tomato sauce, cheese, and pepperoni. The young, blonde, teenage pizza guy was standing in Carl's doorway. His cheeks were even more sunken and emaciated than before, almost melting off his face like so much mozzarella. The waxy lips moved slowly, revealing a few moldy black teeth. Carl realized he was saying something. "Pizza," the tall, thin figure slurred, and as it went on to speak, its top lip fell to the carpet. "Pfefferoni mushroom." It shifted another couple of steps into the room, reaching a thin, almost skeletal hand for Carl. As Carl watched, it continued to rapidly decompose in front of him. Rick suddenly burst into the room with a wooden chair held over his head. He swung it down, breaking it across the intruder's back. The blow sent the pizza guy forward onto Carl's bed, and he clambered along the bed, mouthing soundless words repeatedly. Carl bleakly wondered if its larynx had crumbled and fallen down its throat as he backed against the headboard of the bed. Rick was lifting the chair again, looking at Carl, his eyes filled with questions. "What should I do?" his face seemed to be saying. "He's already dead," Carl gasped. "You already tried once. We can't stop him like that." A cold hand grasped Carl's bare foot, and Carl tried to thrash away from its cold, moist touch. What the hell was it trying to say? "What?" Carl shrieked. "What the hell do you want from me?" It pulled itself up Carl's legs, and that was when Carl could see clearly into its eyes. He froze, and in the milky lens of its orbs he recognized something. Fear. No, not it. The teenager's name had been Steve. Steve was scared, absolutely horrified. His eyes reminded Carl of something he'd seen in his own grandfather's eyes when he'd been dying of cancer. It was a knowing, disturbed look that begged for the finality of death, the end of the pain. "My God, Carl, it's all over you!" Rick yelled, and by that time Nancy and Marty were also at the bedroom door, standing behind Rick. The creature, Steve, put a skeletal hand on Carl's shoulder and pulled himself up so that his face was level with Carl's. As his decayed lips moved, breaths of fetid air blew into Carl's face. The smell of rancid flesh churned his stomach, but he could hear what Steve was trying to say. Steve began. Surf? Nancy yelled out, "Do something, Rick!" Like what? God, Carl, what can I do? $13.50? Barely controlling the bile that rose in his throat, Carl asked, $13.50? The flesh and bone head tilted, and hope flooded through Steve's filmed eyes. For a brief second, Carl saw his own reflection in them. Steve's lips moved closer, quicker, more sure of the words. $13.50! He repeated them frantically now. "Rick, get my wallet." Rick fumbled with the junk on Carl's dresser, throwing a baseball cap off and discovering the black, worn billfold beneath it. He grabbed it. Carl stuck out his left hand, and Rick placed the billfold in it. Steve repeated his relentless chant at a hurried pace, at times pressing his sour-smelling facial flesh, what was left of it, against Carl's cheek. Using one hand, Carl fingered open his wallet, found a bill, and grasped it between two fingers, letting the wallet drop to the floor. He looked over at his hand. It was a green $20 bill. $13.50? $13.50? Carl asked, screaming in a hysterical voice that cracked as he waved the bill in front of Steve's face. He let out a high-pitched cackle as he stuffed the bill into Steve's front shirt pocket. "Here you go! Keep the change!" Steve's eyes remained on Carl, and a smile that split his cheek open graced his face. He then stumbled off the bed and clambered out of the room. They heard something bumping along the wall and tumbling down the stairs into the darkness below. Moments later, the front door slammed shut, and the persistent scent of pizza was finally gone.
Hello, this is Mark Leslie. I've always enjoyed learning a little bit about the stories I'm reading, a bit about the origin of the tales. For that reason, I've taken to inserting author notes whenever the opportunity presents itself. The Pizza Man was first published in the 2012 eBook release of Bumps in the Night. It was first published in print in the Eerie chapbook number 14 in May of 2014. The very first version of this story was written late one evening in 1988 while I was in first-year university, and me and my housemates were perturbed by 2 unsolicited pizza deliveries on the same night. It was either a strange mistake, since we had just moved in the previous week, or a practical joke of sorts, but the part of my mind that finds dark and more disturbing ways to explain situations came up with the murdered teenager concept. So I went up to my room, turned on my Commodore 64 computer, and started cranking out the story on my word processor. When I finished it several hours later, I printed it on my 12-pin dot matrix printer, and I read it to Maureen, who became Marty in the story, and Nana, who became Nancy. They were two of my roommates, and they quite enjoyed the tale, particularly the fact that it was set in our house and featured all of us. My cousin Rodney, who was the inspiration for Rick, shrugged it off the same way Rick shrugged things off in the story. It was a cute short tale, but there wasn't much to it other than a dead guy who kept showing up at the door and a bug-infested, barfing gross-out scene. So I kept picking away at the story over the years, working on turning the characters from caricatures and basically just us roommates and into more developed people with different backstories. Modifying their names from our names and into the characters they would become, and noodling with the plot, coming up with the story. I couldn't decide whether I'd call the story The Pizza Man in the hokey horror comic book style that it was meant to be, or call it 1350. Since paying the pizza guy what he was coming to collect is the key element that Carl uses to finally release poor Steve from his purgatorial existence. Now, just prior to putting this collection together, I ended up sending the story out to a few beta readers to help me fix it up and determine the actual title, and that's how I landed on the title of Pizza Man. I should point out that one of my beta readers, Bill Buick, bears absolutely no relation to the dead pizza kid Steve Buick, as I did compose that name half a dozen years before Bill and I ever met. About the author. Mark Leslie is a writer, editor, and bookseller who was born and grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, spent many years in Ottawa and Hamilton, and currently lives in southern Ontario. Apart from the more than 20 books he has published, Mark is a bookselling veteran who's worked in the industry for more than 25 years. He's worked at virtually every type of bookstore and has given talks across Canada, the United States, in London, Paris, and Frankfurt on the bookselling, writing, and publishing industry. But Mark is most at home, sharing scary stories in a darkened room or around a roaring campfire. You can learn more about Mark and sign up for his newsletter at markleslie.ca.